This is how Rembrandt van Rijn saw himself when he was 23. And this is how he saw himself at the age of 63 when he painted his last self-portrait. Between these two portraits, there were 40 years of drawing, etching, painting, and aging. But his eyes seem timeless and unchanging, as if his personal identity has remained constant throughout the years. Is this how we see ourselves, as individuals with an unchanging personal identity? Do we remain who we are or who we were? Does this enduring self, which we never question, actually exist? Going to sleep and waking up again. For a moment or two, we may not know where we are or what day it is, but we always feel the presence of something familiar, our self. We seem to know our self. We seem to feel our self. We can't imagine what we would be like without that self. And after being asleep all night, we simply pick up where we left off and carry on with what we were doing yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that. But are we the same person we were yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that?
The view that most people instinctively gravitate toward is the notion that there's something within them that is constant, that makes them what they are. The real me, deep down inside all the layers of personality, and that this is the same throughout a lifetime, and you can call that an enduring self. But the trouble is that when you actually look introspectively for this enduring self, the real you, it's very hard to find it.
Do I have a self that stays the same as time passes? This has been a central question of philosophy since the time of the ancient Greeks. But the answer is not easy to find. Even Socrates sometimes doubted the existence of an enduring self.
Although we speak of an individual as being the same so long as he continues to exist in the same form, every bit of him is different, and every day he is becoming a new man, while the old man is ceasing to exist, as you can see from his hair, his flesh, his bones, his blood, and all the rest of his body. And not only his body, for the same thing happens to his soul. And neither his manners, nor his disposition, nor his thoughts, nor his desires, nor his pleasures, nor his sufferings, nor his fears are the same throughout his life, for some of them grow, while others disappear.
It is very difficult to find a self that remains the same from infancy to old age, but we can't leave the question at that. Think of our legal system. If we do not have an enduring self, we cannot be responsible for crimes we committed earlier in life. The fact is, the law does hold us responsible for earlier crimes, regardless of when the crime was committed. Take the war criminal Klaus Barbie as an example. In 1987, Barbie was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes committed 40 years earlier. As an SS officer in World War II, he had tortured and killed many people. Yet during his trial, some people wondered if you should make an old, sick man pay for things he did when he was young and healthy. The question is there a connection between the self of the old man in 1987 and the self of the young SS officer during World War II? If there is no self that remains the same, shouldn't we conclude that Barbie was not responsible for the crimes of the young officer? Even in less dramatic cases, it is important to know if a person has an enduring self. Think of our promises. If two people promise each other eternal love when they are 20 years old, can they still be held responsible for that promise when they are 40? If they are responsible, then there has to be something in them that continues to be the same over time. But what is this continuity? What is this unchangeable self?
Philosophy has always been surrounded by this question. Is there something enduring? And is there also something enduring in the self, together with the self? And in modernity, Descartes was the philosopher who said this: I think, therefore I am. This I think is to some extent an imperishable kernel and the point of absolute certainty. On that kernel, one can let oneself build on it. Descartes is built on it. He built his whole system on it, up until his proof of the existence of God.
Thinking is another attribute of the soul, and here I discover what properly belongs to myself. This alone is inseparable from me. I am, I exist, this is certain. But how often? As often as I think. For perhaps it would even happen, if I should wholly cease to think, that I should at the same time altogether cease to be.
Do we have a thinking soul that makes us today the same person we were yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that? Does this soul explain this feeling of remaining who we are? The feeling that we have our own identity, which remains constant over the years? Does the thinking soul explain why we experience things, do things, have thoughts at different times, and yet know that these thoughts are our own, the products of the same self? Someone who was fascinated by this issue was the 17th century English philosopher John Locke.
Before Locke, philosophers such as Descartes had tended to assume that the identity of a person was the identity of an immaterial substance, was the identity of my mind, where the mind was thought of as by Descartes as a non-material thinking substance. Locke disagrees with that. He holds that what makes a person the same over time is that there must be continuity of memory.
Since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that which makes everyone to be what he calls self, in this alone consists personal identity, that is, the sameness of a rational being. And as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action of thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. It is the same self now it was then.
So that what makes me the same person as a person I was 10 years ago is that I can remember the actions and experiences of the self that I was then.
How did Locke arrive at such a view of the self? Perhaps his own life demonstrates the need of an enduring self. The year is 1675. John Locke has been forced to leave his native country, England. Years of loyal service to his employer, Lord Ashley, naturally led him to take his master's side when he became involved in a political conflict with the British government. The conflict quickly gets out of hand, and both Ashley and Locke fear for their lives. Together, they flee to France, where they stay for 8 years. But when Lord Ashley dies, Locke, fearing persecution, flees to the Netherlands, moving from city to city, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht. He even has to assume a false identity and goes into hiding. Locke is always on the run, dressing differently all the time, changing from country to country, from culture to culture, from language to language. But as he himself put it, he was always the same thinking thing in different times and places. What Locke means by the same thinking thing is a sort of memory which works like the string that holds the beads of a necklace together. Just as the string makes individual beads into a single necklace, so we create a self by threading together memories of events, experiences, and feelings. But what if the necklace breaks? What if we forget parts of our lives? What if our memory lets us down?
Locke seems to committed to the view that if I cannot now remember what I was doing last Sunday, if none of the actions and experiences that were performed in the body that's continuous with my present body, then I am not now the person that I was last Sunday. And that seems paradoxical.
I don't think myself of the self as a thing that is absolutely the same, that goes on unchanging. And I do think that in something like Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, that there is, in a way, a very real loss of self, that in a certain way, the person that you knew slowly ebbs away and slowly ceases to be. Some of the basic behavior patterns can remain until close to the end, but it's, I think, a kind of inescapable thing that the person kind of slowly ceases to be.
Patricia Churchland is both a philosopher and a neuroscientist from the University of California at San Diego, who studies the functioning of the brain in relation to the self.
It seems, for example, as I look around now, that I'm seeing the whole of you, or I'm seeing the whole of the room pretty much at one glance. But in actual fact, we know it isn't so. We know that at any given moment, all you see with clear definition and crispness is about the size of the end of my thumb. And that what happens is that about 3 times a second, your eyes move. And that somehow the brain integrates across that movement to give you the illusion that you see in crispness and clearness the whole range of what's in front of you. Now, that is a kind of illusion. And we think that the brain does it as part of the way that it integrates across time for lots of modalities. Now, the suggestion about the self is that there is there too a kind of integration, that there are a variety of components to selfness, if you like, and that a sort of illusion is created of a unity that goes on through time.
We remember what we used to be like. We know that in the dim and distant past, a certain picture was taken of us. Maybe we can still feel the excitement of the moment, still smell the scent of the surroundings. But now we are so different.
I remember when Dad took that picture. How old was I then? That wispy hair. Oh, how I hated those glasses.
Are we the same person today we were yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that? Is there anything that stays the same and that we can call our self? Descartes and Locke affirmed that there is an enduring self, but many contemporary philosophers have doubts.
I think a self is an accumulation of history, of our lives. In that sense, I don't think there's some independent thing called the self, like a soul, that's there no matter what else is going on. That self gets created, and it can be modified in 1,001 different ways. One can have the kind of experience that is dramatic, that just sort of shapes the way one goes about doing something.
I think that the self is just a name for a network of beliefs and desires that is constantly being revised. And, you know, if you don't teach an infant human being a language, I don't think it's going to have a self. It's like a computer that hasn't been programmed. You know, it just sort of sits there and can't do anything. And in our terminology, doesn't have a self. When you have a program, you have beliefs and desires expressible in language, and automatically you have a self.
A human self is a way of being organized. It's not a thing, it's not an organ, it's not a little pearl. And so it follows that it isn't anything permanent in the sense of like an immortal soul, or like a special marker of some kind which is immutable. It's more like the whirlpool that stays there behind the rock and the stream. No matter how much water runs by, there's still that little whirlpool there, and it has a certain identity, even though the water's changing all the time. The atoms in your body are being shed, and new atoms are taking their place, new cells are being made all the time, and over this long period of time, there's a certain unity. That's what a self is.
The self, an accumulation of history, a whirlpool, a product of language. Does the enduring self actually exist?
The Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century designed a thought experiment. He said, try to look for it. Try to scan what's inside, as it were, and then wait a while and scan again and see if there's something that's a constant, that's still there, the same real you that you can see inside your mind. And of course, people who perform this experiment can't find anything like that.
If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never exist at the same time. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived, and consequently there is no idea.
Actually, in Indian philosophy, Buddha had basically the same argument 2,500 years earlier, or nearly 2,500 years earlier. When people see that, the temptation is to swing to the other extreme and say that there is no self there. And sometimes both Hume and the early Buddhist philosophers are interpreted as having what you can call a no-self view. That is, you think there's something there which is the same throughout your lifetime, but if you look for it, there's nothing. So that all you are is simply a collection of thoughts and feelings that you have from minute to minute, and these keep changing.
Nemen, deze bijvoorbeeld.
Nee, wat mag
ik? Die is voor je. Kijkt u rustig. Ja, oh, dank u.
Masao Abe is a Buddhist philosopher of the Kyoto school in Japan. He explains the no-self view using a story.
Enjadatta is a very handsome young man, and he used to look at the mirror, in the morning, and smile to the image. His image in the mirror. One morning, however, he couldn't see his image, so he thought that his head was lost. He was in consternation, upset, and looked for his head, in and out of the room. Where is my head? Where is my head? And finally, he hit the wall with his head, and then he realized that the head was not lost. Fact is that at that morning, Enjadatta looked at the back of the mirror, so naturally his image is not reflected. He finally realized that he was looking for his head with his head.
Just like we can never see our own head, we can never see our own self. We can keep on looking for it, but we can never see it. We can never substantiate it. It is like viewing the Japanese rock garden at the Ryoan-ji Temple in Kyoto. In this garden, several groups of stones are exposed. In total, there are 15 stones, but we can never see them all at the same time. No matter where we are standing, the most we can see is 14 stones, never 15. The self is like the 15th stone in the garden. We can never see it. No matter how much effort we exert, the self always escapes detection. If there is no true self or enduring self, who or what is it that makes decisions, that is responsible for the past, that has emotions?
Bekersoptiek, goedemiddag. Ja. Och jee.
The assumption is that if you're a sincere person, then what you say not only is going to fit your general attitudes now, it'll have at least some connection with your general attitudes tomorrow, next week, next month. And that has a lot to do with the reliability that we connect with having a good character. It's consistent with change. You can change in a lot of respects, but the assumption is, first of all, that there's some things that you'll be loyal to even if aspects of your personality are in transition. And secondly, that the change will involve typically be gradual and involve a kind of trajectory so that people who deal with you, who rely on you, can know what they can rely on. Most lives actually do have a structure, and as Aristotle said about a good story, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But more important, they have a way in which you can see elements in the early middle connected with things that happen later in the late middle or towards the end. And to the extent that people have a sense of authorship of their own lives, the continuities will include those that are contributed by character. The sense that this is the life that I had in part because of the kind of person that I am.
Meneer Bekers, komt u maar.
Am I the same person today that I was yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that? We all tell a story about ourselves, a life story which connects our past to our future. A story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Would we be able to live without such a story? It's a girl. She has her mother's eyes and her father's temperament. She has a name, Julia, and though she's not yet aware of it, one day she'll have a sense of self, of her own identity. An identity which she'll be able to recognize as her own personal identity. But sometimes she won't be sure. One day she'll leaf through an old photo album and think, is that me? The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.